The Ukrainian Defense Forces have once again attacked the Saratov oil refinery. Explosions and a fire have been reported in the area of the facility. This information has been confirmed by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Let me remind you that this refinery specializes in the production of gasoline, diesel fuel, fuel oil, and other products. There are more than 20 types of products in total. The plant is also part of the Rosneft oil company and supplies fuel to the Russian armed forces. Exactly 1 month ago, on September 16th, the Ukrainian armed forces struck this facility. On Friday, Russia may decide to suspend hostilities to carry out repairs at the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant. This was reported to Russian media by the head of Rosatom, Alexei Likachov. He stated that the Director General of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, has taken on the role of mediator in this matter. The discussion concerns allocating 6 to 7 days for work on the damaged power lines located in areas controlled by Ukraine, but occupied by Russian forces. At the same time, Ukraine, the Ukrainian side, has repeatedly stated that it cannot begin repairs due to constant Russian shelling. And it is precisely as a result of these strikes that the power lines supplying the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant were damaged. Since the beginning of the day, more than 60 combat clashes have been recorded on the front line. This was reported by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. The most tense situation is in the Kupiansk, Pokrovsk, and Alexandrovsk directions. More details about the situation on the front line are coming up next.
Mercenaries from North Korea are assisting the Russians in the Sumy region, operating drones and adjusting strikes on Ukrainian positions. They are operating from the Kursk region. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the enemy is suffering critical personnel losses amid the complete failure of their offensive in the Sumy region and is therefore involving North Korean contractors in active combat operations. Meanwhile, in the same Sumy direction, Ukrainian scouts from the Hrom division of the 225th Separate Assault Regiment detected preparations by Russian occupiers to cross the river. With precise artillery strikes, the Russian army soldiers were eliminated right on the riverbank. In the Lyman direction, Ukrainian defenders destroyed a Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group, thwarting the occupiers' plans to create a bridgehead for an offensive on Oskil. The corresponding video footage was released by the 3rd Army Corps. They note that enemy personnel were eliminated during an attempt to break through into the forested area near the Izium-Slavyansk highway. As a result of the clearing operation, it was possible to preserve the logistical routes to the front line. At the same time, since the beginning of the day, clashes have been recorded in the Kupiansk direction near the settlements of Petra Pavlovka, Peshanoe, and Boguslavka. In the Pokrovsk sector, Russian occupiers attempted to attack near Shakove, Krasny Lyman, Novoekonomicheskoye, Kotlin, and Filia. And on the Alexandrovka section of the front, Ukrainian defenders repelled enemy assaults near the settlements of Zelenigay, Novokatskaya, Sosnovka, Verbovoye, Novonikolayevka, and Novogrigorovka.
The occupiers have changed their tactics of conducting combat operations. For the first time in the past year, a large amount of armored vehicles and accordingly personnel were used in an attempt to break through Ukrainian defensive fortress structures. We're talking about the so-called tactic, better known as not sparing the cost. That is, they fully understand that when they throw tank battalions into the attack, meaning more than 30 armored vehicles, at best no more than 5, well, at most 7 armored vehicles will actually reach the positions of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. In other words, they are deliberately accepting massive casualties among their personnel and accordingly the destruction of heavy armored vehicles, of which the occupiers don't have that many left. The main goal is to try to land assault groups. This is what you are now showing. The aim is to gain a foothold and accordingly later use the so-called tactic of meat assaults.
Russian forces attempted a large-scale mechanized attack on Dobropilia. The enemy's ultimate goal was to capture the settlement of Shakove. The Russians sent 22 armored vehicles into the assault. According to the National Guard of Ukraine, the enemy intended to make it more difficult for Ukrainian defenders to mine the routes of the Russian troops' advance. The maneuver was unsuccessful. 2 armored vehicles were detected by reconnaissance and destroyed by artillery and FPV drones from the unmanned systems forces even before they could attempt to take cover in the forest. Meanwhile, the Russians are frantically trying to finish building a hospital in Sevastopol, in temporarily occupied Crimea, due to catastrophic losses on the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia fronts. This was reported by the partisan movement Atesh. According to agents, construction of the facility began back in 2022 and was originally scheduled for completion only at the end of 2026. However, the influx of wounded has exceeded all expectations, and the existing facilities can no longer cope. The builders are working in 3 shifts, violating all technological standards, cutting corners on materials and safety, which leads to frequent incidents at the site. Distortions in the structures and problems with the foundation are already noticeable.
According to the Russian side's own assessment, the loss coefficient, that is, the number of irrecoverable losses, the so-called 200ths, has now equaled the coefficient of sanitary losses. These are the so-called 300ths. Whereas global practice is 1 to 3, meaning for every 1 killed, there are usually 3 wounded.
This is clear evidence of the truly dire and critical situation currently facing the Russian army, specifically regarding the state of medical evacuation directly from the very dangerous front line of contact and, consequently, the overall poor level of tactical medicine available.
Over the past day, Ukraine's defense forces have eliminated 1,080 Russian servicemen. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the total losses of the Russian army since the start of the full-scale aggression have exceeded 1,127,000 people. In addition, over the past day, 2 Russian tanks, 9 armored combat vehicles, 42 artillery systems, and 139 units of enemy automotive equipment were destroyed.
The European Commission has proposed to member states a roadmap for defense readiness by 2030, called the Plan to Strengthen European Defense Capabilities. The document will be discussed at a meeting of leaders in Brussels as early as next week.
This is a roadmap for defense readiness, a plan to maintain peace. Over the next several years, it is necessary to significantly increase Europe's defense capabilities. Today, Russia does not have the capability to attack the European Union, but it could prepare to do so in the coming years. The danger does not disappear even if the war in Ukraine ends. The member states have identified 9 areas of work in line with NATO's objectives. The roadmap is a plan to fill these gaps with clear goals, deadlines, and progress indicators.
We want to achieve a certain level of defense capability by 2030. Why? Because of Putin's plans. We have to deter aggression, prevent wars, and maintain peace. This is precisely the essence of the roadmap. To achieve this important and ambitious goal, we must fully reach the new NATO targets by the year 2030. According to the most recent and publicly available information, our current progress as it stands is only 50% of the required result, which means we still have a significant way to go. See
NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte urged not to overestimate Russia's capabilities. He emphasized that the North Atlantic Alliance is 25 times larger than Russia. NATO's total economy amounts to 50 trillion compared to Russia's 2 trillion. Rutte also ironically noted that Russians are not very good at handling their planes and ships, since they constantly violate other countries' airspace or damage undersea cables with their anchors.
Russia's economy is no bigger than the economy of the state of Texas and no bigger than the combined economies of the Netherlands and Belgium. Of course, this is taking into account their nuclear potential. But I wouldn't compare it to Belgium and the Netherlands as a whole. At the same time, we shouldn't overestimate Russia's capabilities either. We know that their fighter pilots are not very skilled at flying planes, and the captains of their ships don't know how to drop anchor properly, considering everything they've done on the seabed. Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General, during a briefing.
In the event of an incursion into Swedish airspace, violators will first be called upon to leave the country's borders, but the next step will be to shoot down the aircraft. Swedish Defense Minister Pål Jonson stated this to RBC Ukraine. He emphasized that such decisions cannot be made by an entire committee. According to the Swedish minister, this should be done by pilots or commanders of surface vessels. If we have to wait for approval, Johnson added, military effectiveness will be reduced.
I believe that Sweden has a very clear mandate. In the event of an incursion into Swedish airspace by a foreign military aircraft, our first measure will be to demand that they leave the country's territory. But if you pose a military threat, then in the end you will be shot down. Pål Jonson, Sweden's Minister of Defense, in an interview with RBC Ukraine.
The German government will respond to Russia's hybrid war with a comprehensive plan to counter such threats. This was stated by Chancellor Friedrich Merz during his speech in the Bundestag. The head of the German government emphasized that Germany will repel the offensive launched by Kremlin leader Putin. Merz accused Russia of attempting to destabilize the situation in Germany and Europe through hybrid means of aggression. But according to the Chancellor, Putin miscalculated, since Germany will not allow itself to be intimidated and will defend itself resolutely, as well as continue to support Ukraine.
We do not want this to prolong the war. On the contrary, we strive for everything to end as soon as possible. At the same time, Putin must realize that our support for Ukraine will not weaken, but on the contrary will grow, and he should not count on outlasting us.
Russia is building up troops near the EU borders and preparing for the second phase of military aggression, according to Finnish Defense Minister Antti Häkkinen. On the sidelines of the NATO North Atlantic Council meeting, he expressed confidence that even after the war in Ukraine ends, Russia will still pose a threat to Europe, since the Kremlin is currently expanding its military efforts in preparation for the second phase of its potential attack. The Finnish defense minister is convinced. Häkkinen stated that Finland recognizes the importance of supporting Ukrainians today as an investment in Europe's security, and therefore will join in the purchase of American weapons for Kyiv. Also, information about a new aid package for Ukraine from Finland will be made public this week. Russia has intensified hybrid attacks on Europe and has entered the so-called zero phase of its campaign to prepare for a possible war against NATO. This is the opinion of analysts from the Institute for the Study of War. Recently, Estonian border guards decided to temporarily close the Satsasapa checkpoint. The reason was the movement of a group of armed men without identification marks. The Estonian border guard requested information from the Russian side about what was happening at the border and received a response that, quote, absolutely routine activities were taking place. How the Baltic countries are responding to threats from the Kremlin will be explained by my colleague Larissa Petruk.
NATO countries are preparing to repel likely future attacks from Russia. The alliance is developing new rules to combat airspace violators, announced Belgian Defense Minister Theo Franken. The heads of the alliance's defense departments want Russian military aircraft in Allied airspace to be considered legitimate targets. The European Union is also preparing for a possible attack by Russia. Brussels intends to carry out a large-scale defense reform, which includes joint production of weapons, including drones. By the end of 2027, the plan envisions that the European Union will make 40% of its defense purchases jointly, which is more than double the current figure. European Union countries must coordinate their defense spending and quickly form coalitions to develop new defense programs. These steps should be taken within the next year if the continent intends to achieve its goal and be ready for combat operations by 2030. From a Bloomberg publication.
By using various ships, an old fleet and whatever else, Russia unfortunately can penetrate deep into Europe, and we must be prepared for this. That is why I believe that not developing counter-drone and drone capabilities these days would be irresponsible.
Western intelligence agencies warn that the most likely targets of Moscow's aggression could be the Baltic states. Estonia takes this threat seriously. The Estonian Ministry of Defense stated that anyone who wishes will be able to undergo training in drone operation. The Estonian Defense Ministry emphasized that the Ukrainian experience has proven the necessity and effectiveness of using strike and reconnaissance UAVs in modern warfare. In 2026, the country will spend more than 5% of its GDP on defense, President Alarkaris noted. Lithuania is also preparing to increase its spending on the military and defense industry to 5% of GDP. Vilnius must fulfill its commitments, insists Gitanas Nausėda.
These are not just words or phrases for the outside world, because all our actions are being evaluated. Lithuania's reputational reliability is assessed based on them. If we now jeopardize our reputation with our words or actions, it will have very serious consequences. Yes, this requires significant financial resources, but we should fulfill our obligations because in the event of a real threat, we want to defend ourselves together with our allies, not alone. Gitanas Nausėda, president of Lithuania, from a Delphi publication.
Russia could attack alliance countries much earlier than 2030, the German Federal Intelligence Service has warned. The Kremlin is already rehearsing its usual scenario. Narratives that have been used for decades are now being applied to the Baltic states, the invasion of Georgia, the occupation of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, the annexation of Crimea, and finally the full-scale war against Ukraine. All of this was declared by Russian propaganda as measures to protect the Russian-speaking population. Now the Kremlin plans to impose its so-called Russian world on Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia. On October 14th, the chairman of the Russian State Duma, Vyacheslav Volodin, stated that the Latvian authorities are persecuting the Russian-speaking population in Latvia and that Russia must protect its compatriots in the Baltic countries. The leader of the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia and State Duma deputy Leonid Slutsky also stated that Russians in Latvia are part of the Russian world. The Kremlin's concept of the Russian world is a deliberately vague ideological construct which Putin has defined as encompassing any former territory of Kievan Rus, the Tsardom of Moscow, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and the modern Russian Federation, from a report by the Institute for the Study of War. To protect themselves from Russian threats, it is not enough to have weapons. Political will is also necessary, says Andrius Kubilius, the European Commissioner for Defense and Space. He emphasized that Putin uses every possible means of hybrid warfare to undermine Europe's political and defense readiness. Larisa Petruk for Freedom TV channel.
On October 16th, the committees of the European Parliament supported projects that provide for a complete EU ban on Russian gas and oil. According to the European Parliament's press service, the Committees on Industry, Energy and International Trade approved a proposal to ban the import of any Russian gas into the EU, including liquefied gas, starting from January 1st, 2026. Some exceptions are provided only for existing short-term and long-term contracts, if they were concluded before June 17th of this year. Oil prices rose after Donald Trump announced that India intends to stop importing Russian fuel. Brent futures rose to $62.14 per barrel, while WTI climbed to $58.50. According to Reuters, Indian refineries are already preparing to gradually reduce oil imports from Russia. Nikita Skoblikov will tell you more.
According to the U.S. president, India is ready to stop purchasing Russian oil. Donald Trump stated that Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi promised him to gradually phase out energy supplies from Russia. This will take some time, but there will be results, the head of the White House assured.
We were dissatisfied with the fact that India was buying Russian oil because it allows Russia to continue the war in which it has already lost 1.5 million people. That's why I was not pleased that India was purchasing raw materials from Russia. And he assured me that they would not buy oil from Russia. This is a serious step.
In response to the words of the American leader, India's Ministry of External Affairs stated that New Delhi's import policy is entirely guided, I quote, by protecting the interests of Indian consumers amid an unstable energy market. At the same time, the Indian side noted that it is interested in diversifying its supplies and expanding energy cooperation with the United States.
As for the United States, we have been striving for many years to expand our purchases of energy resources. Over the past decade, this process has steadily advanced. The current administration has shown interest in deepening energy cooperation with India. Discussions are ongoing. And a statement from India's Ministry of External Affairs on the social network X.
Some Indian oil refineries are already preparing to gradually reduce imports of Russian oil, Bloomberg reports. However, according to the agency, executives from the 4 largest companies, which account for more than 80% of the country's refining capacity, noted that they expect a decrease in supply volumes, but not a complete halt as Trump claimed. Analysts have calculated that if New Delhi really does stop importing Russian oil, Moscow will lose at least a quarter of its total exports, and not even China will be able to make up for these losses.
For India, the West is a natural ally, including in its confrontation with China. And for India, it is clear that its main markets are not only, and not so much, Asia or Africa, where it is very difficult to compete with China, but rather the European continent and the United States. And it is also clear that recently India has begun to actively develop military cooperation with the United States, and all of this suggests that, one way or another, it seems quite natural for India to refuse Russian oil.
Washington also intends to increase pressure on the largest buyer of Russian oil, China. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated that most senators support the idea of imposing tariffs against Beijing. However, he emphasized that for this step to be effective, a unified position with European allies is necessary. Let me remind you, according to Forbes, in 2024, China imported a record 108.5 million tons of oil from Russia.
China buys 60% of Russian energy resources. It buys 90% of Iranian energy resources. So who is fueling the Russian war machine? 85 U.S. senators are ready to grant President Trump the authority to impose tariffs on Chinese imports of Russian oil of up to 500%.
The U.S. Secretary of the Treasury has called on Japan to completely stop importing Russian energy resources. He said this to his Japanese counterpart on October 15th on the sidelines of the annual meeting of the International Monetary Fund. Reuters summarizes, The current US administration is pushing for its allies in Asia and Europe to maximize energy pressure on Moscow. Nikita Skoblikov for Freedom TV channel.